The Spin-Off Podcast Network.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. The Investment Fix podcast. Tune in today.
The Fold is brought to you by oMedia, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Nau mai, hoki mai kia The Fold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. This is The Fold. This is a real special one, I reckon. It's with Kirsty Johnston, who is a senior writer at Stuff, and I will background her and what she says shortly. But this is also the start of a little run I'm going to do of speaking to people who make things. I just realized recently that I'd basically spent the first half of this year talking to CEOs and the broadcasting minister and people who I find really fascinating, but are also, you know, in some ways quite remote from the production line of the media. And I'm going to fix that by interviewing a bunch of people who are much closer to, if not actually with their hands on the tools. And Kirsty Johnston is a really good place to start that, I think. I've known Kirsty for 10 years or so, and I talk about the night that we met at Kim.com's house at the top of this. But her career has been probably one of, if not the most impressive of any young journalist over the past decade. She has broken enormous stories and very consequential stories often about the kinds of people who really struggle to make the news in a lot of ways, who don't have a tremendous amount of people out there scrutinizing their lives, and as a result benefit disproportionately when their stories, often very heartrending stories, are told. She broke the story, or not necessarily broke the story as she acknowledges, but certainly amplified the story of Ashley Peacock's seclusion in a way that just got him out of that environment. She spent a year at Papakura High School just showing the lives of kids there. She's told amazing stories about housing and education, and is currently obsessed with the family court. And most recently, she had a huge hit, if that's the right word for it, with the story of Mrs. P, which I strongly encourage you to look up. So we talk about her career, but we also talk about the difference between the Herald and Stuff as newsrooms, and she is potentially career-limitingly candid about her. I shouldn't say career-limitingly, because she's one of those journalists who can, basically do whatever she wants. It's that fierce devotion to her craft that makes her so special. You just get a real strong sense of who she is as a person and of what motivates her as a journalist. And I think it's a very entertaining listen, and I think it just shows what just a really impressive and specific character she is. So this is Kirsty Johnston on The Fold. I should say that The Fold is proudly supported by Vodafone. The spin-off runs on Vodafone network technology. We do a lot of quite chunky work. We record podcasts, as you may or may not know. We deal with 4K video files. We switched to remote working during the pandemic. It's a lot, and you really need it to work, and it does. Find out more at vodafone.co.nz. This is Kirsty Johnston, the first of my creator series on The Fold. Kia ora, Kirsty Johnston.
Kia ora, I'm here in Auckland. It's so exciting.
Which is buzzy, because I think of you as an Aucklander, even though you famously, to my mind, wrote a piece saying how Auckland was bad.
Yeah, and then I had to take it back. Remember, 9 months later, I was just crept back in quietly so no one could throw that in my face.
I feel like we should have revoked your sort of regional passport or something.
Yeah, but I'm in Tauranga now, which is mini Auckland, but worse.
Is that its sort of new official slogan?
That's my slogan for it.
I love that. All right. I want to actually get back to when we first met.
Oh.
Do you remember?
No.
It was at Kim.com's house.
Yes, and I was really hungover.
Were you?
I think so.
I feel like we were just on our way to a good hangover. It was during that weird time, a very little like sliver of the moment where there were heaps of journalists at Kim.com's house semi-often.
We gave you a ride home.
You did.
I remember this now.
Yeah.
And I was mainly like hyperventilating the entire time because he has swans. Remember he had those swans? And I'm like terrified of birds. So the whole time I was trying to have conversations with people, but I was like one eye on the swans.
Swans will fuck you up.
Yes.
And the thing that I remember most vividly about that car ride home was like, because I was already a big fan of your journalism, and you were like, I'm just like a classic old bleeding heart or something. And I was like, because it felt to me at the time like that was almost like a negative, pejorative thing to that you might throw at someone. But it's almost like when you look at how society has moved since then, and certainly the body of work that you've created subsequently, it kind of accurately sums up. You just go after telling the stories of people who have really had it super rough, and you seem to like carry and inhabit that. Is that fair? That's a real long question.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember I learnt that word bleeding heart from a reporter at the Taranaki Daily News, Lynn. She was like, she always referred to herself as like Auntie Lynn in the newsroom. And she was amazing. And she'd always gone about how she was a bleeding heart liberal. And I was like 21. I was like, what's a liberal? Don't know. But I remember the bleeding heart bit. And I think I just used that word without actually maybe knowing what it was. And then I just kind of enjoyed applying it, ironically. But yeah, I think for me, like, so the reason I tell people's deep stories is not only because of them and I care what happened to them, is because I'm always trying to like illustrate structural change. And so you can't really, or like structural issues to get structural change, and you can't do that without humans. And so that's kind of why I go down that path. Like usually those people have those stories in and of themselves, and sometimes you'll get a story that doesn't really have any necessary structural stuff, but mainly that's why I do it.
Because I remember there was an interview that you did, a revolutionary, as he was fond of calling them, email interview with Steve Bronius a few years ago, where you talked about that, Donna Chisholm basically saying, start writing about people if you're so animated by these issues. And that does seem to be almost like a mode shift that you went through that has been the making of you.
Yeah, that really, poor Donna. Like, she's always like, it was just a throwaway comment. And I'm like, no, that was the best. That was the best thing that happened. That's why I made the Papakura high school documentary, because I was writing about all these education issues, which I think is still there. Haven't checked, but can't really assume much has changed with inequality. And it's really hard to tell, like, that Auckland inequality story. And so I wanted to do it through humans. And then I think it was you, Duncan. It was you, actually, who said, why don't you do, what's the football, Friday Night Lights? You were like, do it like Friday Night Lights. And then I literally the next day emailed a principal, like, want to do a thing? And he said yes.
So I actually wanted to talk about that later, but let's talk about it now because it's come up, because I really, really loved it. I totally disavow any responsibility for it, but it was the sense of following a group over the course of a year and of you getting comfortable with them and them with you, and just sort of easing into the sort of realities of their life. That's what made that documentary have that power, because it's just there. It's not engineered in any way.
Yeah, we just literally hung around and asked the kids questions, and like they'd be real awkward and we'd be awkward because it was just awkward hanging around with them all the time with a camera. But it got less like that, and they got really used to us, and it was so nice. Like, it was such a great year. Like, obviously I nearly died from the stress of it, but I remember going to the ball with them, and like it was so fun. And like, honestly, one of them was late and he didn't nearly make it on the bus, and I was like, are we allowed to intervene at this point and go and get him, because I need these shots for my documentary? But we couldn't. We did just sit there and be like, come on, Robbie, like, come on, where are you?
Robbie made it?
Yeah, he made it. But yeah, it was so good. And I think, I don't really know if it achieved what we wanted in terms of like breaking open the, conversation, but it achieved something in that you really got to see what those kids' lives were like.
Yeah, some of that comes down to, like, you know, I personally feel like that style of documentary making, which, you know, you look at something like Last Chance U or Cheer, is those things are massive internationally. It would almost take someone, you know, it was on the Herald platform. They gave it a really good push, but in some ways it would have made more sense for it to be like a TV half hour or, you know, that screened over a few weeks, for example. Like,
yeah, I think we initially talked to Māori TV about showing it, but I can't remember what happened with that. And in saying that, it was such like a small budget production as well. That was the first time that a newspaper had got money from New Zealand on air for something like that, and I think we didn't get much. It was
like 70 grand or something.
Yeah, 70 grand. And then we all just worked a lot.
It's just the way. Just the way. And that kind of gets to, like, in some ways, another quote from that interview was that you described yourself as doomed to be a journalist, which is just a real funny way to put it. But it also feels accurate. Like, I think of, like, I know quite a number of people who are, you know, sort of super talented, came through journalism and hit kind of a wall where there is some sort of financial, emotional thing that happens to you, and often at a particular age it coincides with some other kind of life changes. And to step out of that, to kind of have your job be a job and not be a thing that just sort of rolls over your entire life, you need to go and work in comms. But that just doesn't seem like it's a possibility for you.
Yeah, I don't think it is. I recently had a concussion at the end of last year.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, in a very unglamorous way. I had my wisdom teeth out, and then the sedation didn't agree with me, and I just passed out into the floor in the middle of the night. And yeah, so that required me to do a lot of self-reflection. But basically, I remember being at the occupational therapist, and she's like, "Now, how are you working?" And I was like, "Look, I'm only doing 9 to 5." And she's like, "Okay, we'll just back up. Only 9 to 5." She's like, "That's what you're paid for." I'm like, "Oh, yeah. Well, anyway," you know?
Yeah.
And I just reflected on that, and then she got me to rewrite down what work meant to me and what my goals were and what success looked like. And so I've kind of done some work to make it a bit more sustainable, but it's pretty hard. You're either in or out, I think, with the type of journalism that I'm doing.
So how did you get down that path? Because, you know, there's obviously that these are human stories. They're also you're an investigative journalist, and that's notoriously the thing that is hard to find and that hard to create investigative journalists. There's some degree of temperament, but there's also an organisation has to bet on you. But it feels like in some ways, I don't know if this is entirely fair, you kind of bet on yourself and made yourself into it by scratching and clawing.
What happened? I won the Voyager Award for Best Investigation, and I was like, wow, guess I'm an investigative journalist now. I think I was at the Sunday Star Times, and I wrote a big piece about how the government had quietly shut down all these residential homes for the disabled because they'd been abusing the people that lived there. The staff had been, and so I just did this big OAA request and wrote a big series on that, and it won. And so then I went overseas for a year, and when I came back to the Herald, I remember they hired me, and I was thinking, I was going to do some kind of role like that. And there were journalists there like David Fisher, and, you know, he was kind of off book, and I thought I'd be like that. And my second day there, they were like, okay, well, you're going to be education reporter. And I went home and cried. So I was like, I don't want to write about schools, you know. And then I just kind of investigated schools and really tried to just break the systemic stuff there apart about inequality, and just basically nagged the Herald, I think. And at the same time, they created the I-Team, which they've kind of now randomly disavowed.
And then brought back again.
And then brought back. And they have this weird thing where they're like, oh, that wasn't actually a thing. We're like, well, Jared's job title was, head of the investigations team, and he had 10 direct reports, but okay. But yeah, so I was definitely part of that kind of just after it started. So, I mean, the most recent investigation of yours that I think was that into
it's a tragic, like, you know, this will make your heart bleed. The case of Mrs. P. Do you want to talk about the genesis of that story and I thought it was quite an interesting kind of stylistic thing that you did, where it was so spare. It was just the beats, because the beats were so strong that it kind of wore you down.
Yeah, so that was a story about the family court, which I've somehow ended up writing about a lot. I didn't really start out meaning to. I really wanted to write about domestic violence because it is a scourge, but I don't feel like any of the reporting that's happening at the moment really captures it. I didn't feel like that. It's a really difficult thing to capture because it's not how people think it is. You know, everyone thinks it looks like once were warriors. They think it's criminal. They think, you know, drunk dudes beat their wives and they go to court, you know. And it's not like that. It's not like that at all. It's coercive control. It happens like all the perpetrators I've been writing about are like architects or accountants or lawyers, you know, they're white guys. And I remember talking to, you know, Jackie Clark, who runs the domestic violence charity, the aunties. She was like, you need to write about white men. So that's what I started doing. And there are some cases within the kind of family court purview, I guess, that have been going on for ages. And just like in criminal law, they are kind of these definitive cases. And this woman's, Mrs. P's, was one that I kind of heard about. Also because there was an article in the Gisborne Herald about her refusing to stand for a judge. And I was like, what is that? And I remember asking one of the other women who'd had the same judge. I was like, do you know about this? And she said, yeah. And then so I eventually found the woman, Mrs. P.
Do you want to describe basically her experience of life? Because I think that, you know, if people haven't read it, I strongly urge you to seek it out. But if not, it's worth kind of getting into the bones of that story. So she split from her husband, who she said was abusive, and she had quite a lot of evidence of that. And they broke up. They did a property settlement, and then they kind of did another one. Like, that's all a bit murky, that stuff. But effectively, they ended up getting to court after a few years. And she said she only signed the first agreement, which was kind of unfair to her, was quite unfair to her, under duress, because he'd been abusing her for 16 years. And he said, you know, he only signed the second one because he had mental health problems or something. But effectively, the judge in her family court case, Judge Peter Kalinikos, didn't believe that she had been abused. And some of the basis of that was this one document that she had altered. It was like an ACC counselling form. And on that form, they kind of write, you know, some spare details about her case. And the counsellor had written them down wrong. And so Mrs. P, who's like this very diligent, fact-oriented person, had amended them so that it was correct. And then she signed that document in with her affidavit, and they said, is it true and correct? And she said yes. But then in the court's view, they were like, you've amended a document, which is no. You know, that's like in the law, that's the worst thing you can do. So the judge really took against her. It's extraordinary, some of what you quote him saying, and the sense of him sounding much more like a prosecution, like a defence lawyer than like a judge. It's an incredibly hostile line he pursues.
Yeah, and I think like within that story, we couldn't even get the breadth of it, but it's kind of him and the husband's lawyer going at her, and she's trying to answer these questions, and she's struggling, and you can, even just reading the transcript, you can see her struggling. And they're like, you lied, and she's like, I didn't lie. And they're like, he didn't abuse you, and she's like, well, he did. And this goes on, and in the end, after the judgment came out, the judge ended up referring her case for a criminal prosecution. So like from the family area to the police did this really half-assed investigation, charged her. And then, you know, because she got criminal charges, she was a teacher, she lost her job. Like, she was on home detention for a year. Like, she lost everything. You know, she was living in a garage with no hot water. For really difficult reasons. Like, you can't really, it's just reading it now, you're like, what happened? It's kind of like, yeah, it's really difficult to get your head around, I think. And I think readers felt that as well, which I was totally taken aback by.
In what sense?
Like, I think because I'd been so deep in the story by that point, and it'd been so hard to get her on board and to get her comfortable because, she's like, it'd been really awful for her. So I think I was really shocked when it came out and that the reaction was so massive. I'd kind of forgotten how actually awful it was, I mean, it was a miscarriage of justice. That's what eventually happened. The Court of Appeal ruled that the perjury charges, the criminal charges, were unfounded.
I mean, and the thing about that story is, I guess, that you were able to tell, and that this was based on a lot of official records coming out of the justice system that were kind of, that were there in black and white. And there was another story of yours which sort of dealt with the inverse of that actually feels like it is there in a lot of what you can and can't do, which was the university lecturer who, and again, like, I mean, you were largely writing about what, what wouldn't be released to you and the extent to which in public institutions, laws that are, feel like there's an incredibly wide, just a long bow drawn that end up protecting, people who have got long records of just pretty terrible behaviour within a workplace context. Do you want to talk about privacy law and the OIA and the limits of those things and how familiar you are with the Ombudsman?
Yeah, so it's really interesting, hey, like Mrs. P's case, because it was there in black and white in the judgments, that's what like you said, that's why I stuck to that in the story, because it's there. If you stray outside of that, you risk, legal repercussion. And then, in the story about the professor who sexually harassed someone, I wasn't able to get any of the information, which I mean, employment law, that part of employment law that covers privacy, I think is just so deeply problematic. And you see it coming up again and again and again. And it's come up in the Trevor Mallard case with the alleged rapist in Parliament. And they're like, oh, it's employment law, we can't tell you. And I honestly don't understand why it covers that kind of thing. I mean, I think if you have harassed somebody in a workplace, and particularly if the harassment has been upheld, I think, and you're not being named, or even if you are, I think it's fair to release that, because in the professor's case, it's like he goes on to what, universities are deeply hierarchical places. He's going to have junior staff under him. He's going to have access to young women like students. I don't think it's ethical to have that kept secret, and I don't understand. And I had a large argument with the Ombudsman about it, and they just can't do anything because that's what privacy law says with regards to employment law. Yeah,
and it's got to think that either as a student or someone who's considering a workplace, the more information you have, the more you're able to protect yourself as much as anything.
Yeah, and I said that to the Ombudsman. I said, I think it's in the public interest. But it doesn't outweigh those privacy interests. And I can't make sense of it, and I think it needs to be revisited, but I don't really know who's pushing for that, or like where or what law needs to be changed. And I don't know why more people aren't making noise about it. I mean, it's so broad. Like, look at what's happening right now with, I don't know if you want to talk about it, with the Devlin case at NZME.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a super interesting case where the first spark of it was him. I don't think it's allegedly. He admitted swinging a punch at a colleague, which he says he had never any intention of connecting, but that's beside the point. Really an extraordinary, in my view, non-apology issued there. And then he goes on to make references to sort of a couple of innocent emails that were misinterpreted, and you just go, this feels like it's got a lot more run. And sure enough, today I think that they announced that he's been stood down again after what was clearly an incredibly brief investigation. You tweeted in the aftermath of that about having seen some things there and having kind of considered, or reconsidered them in the aftermath. It's quite interesting, right? Because you're a journalist and but you're also an employee, and you're scrutinising other people's workplaces while also being in one. And this is a case where, your eyes might not have been attuned to something. Do you want to talk about the Devlin case and how it sort of sits in terms of the framework with which you view these things?
Yeah, it's so interesting, like the hypocrisy of media. We talk about it all the time, like the other reporters. We're busy writing about everyone else being scumbags or harassing people, and it's like, we should probably have a look in our own backyard. And I think the Martin Devlin one is the first time.
Hi there, just Duncan here, popping in post to say that we've had to cut this due to the small but real risk that it was a bit too intense to run. So unfortunately, you'll have to just guess at what was said. Now, back to the fold. Is there a tension, do you think, between that sort of star system that seems to inhabit radio, where they are kind of coddled to some extent, or certainly that's the reputation? I've not worked in radio myself, whereas a newsroom it obviously has its stars in some respects, but it's not quite the same kind of, we have to keep this person so we can maintain our share over our crosstown rival.
The audience thing with radio is different, right?
Certainly that is the thesis, but then every so often one just falls and things seem to work themselves out. You don't have to keep employing Tony Veitch, it turns out, because you can find another...
Yeah, and was it like Larry thingy left and Kerry McIver took over and it was all fine and everyone was like panicking about, this guy leaving, and she took over and still good, like the numbers are still there. Yeah,
I think people underestimate there is a sort of a cult around various broadcasters, which in some rare occasions is justified, but mostly it's just people aren't good at changing their TV channel, they're not good at moving their radio dial.
Sorry radio people. No, but yeah, there is definitely something around those hosts are like kind of, they are deified, they are godlike. And I mean, look, I don't know how many bridges I want to burn here, but when I was at the Herald, I remember I once tweeted something about Mike Hosking, and it was very it was like funny and light and not a big deal. It was just something you'd said or done. And I got told off, like I got a formal telling off, like don't tweet that, delete it, like you can't just tweet about him. Like my manager took me into the kitchen and sat me down and was like, you need to stop doing that, it's upsetting the management. That didn't just happen to me, it happened to other reporters in the building. And yet at the same time, what used to like really upset us was that Hosking would take our stories on the radio and just rip them to shreds. That's
a big part of his shtick, is the critiquing the media while also being the most highly paid person in the media.
Yeah, so he's like there, like destroying one of my stories on air, like doubting its credibility, like just being like, who does this reporter think she is? And so he's allowed to do that, and we'd be like, why is he allowed to do that? And we're not allowed to be like, lol, have you seen his $3,000 loafers today? His Gucci loafers. It was weird, and I think like it's all very funny and like that was annoying to me. Maybe it's not meaningful, but I think within that context of workplace power structures, it is a problem.
Well, that clearly is part of the enabling structure that allowed Devlin to behave the way he did and without consequences.
Yeah, for a long time. I mean, I don't know who's going to keep writing about it. I mean, they've got the irony that their own reporter, Katie Harris, is doing the reporting on it. It has not escaped me. So I don't know if she would have got that story across the line if Stuff hadn't broken their story.
I mean, we had multiple inquiries in, and I was in communications with their head of comms getting no replies, which is very weird. Normally you get at least a holding pattern, and that was the worst kept secret in media at the time, that something was going on there. But yeah, I mean, it does go to what your earlier point about media struggles to report on itself, particularly. We can talk about the business of media. Hi, this is the fault.
Oh, here we go.
but the actual, where we stray into things that would be reportable were they to happen at any other kind of big corporate, they suddenly really struggle to know how to deal with it, especially kind of where you've got a big organization that wraps up radio with its kind of power structures and dynamics and a print newsroom.
Yeah, it's so difficult. Like, when you're a reporter in that environment, so it's a corporate environment just like any other, you see things happening, you know that they're bad because you write about them, you want to do something, but equally you're just an employee. You'd probably like to go to HR, but everyone knows that HR isn't really there for the employees. It's just to limit liability to the company as far as I can tell. And then also you've got that power dynamic of particularly young women not wanting to be tarred with the, oh, she's difficult brush. And that's why I know some of those girls didn't complain. Because it's something that will follow you for your whole career, and that is still strong throughout every organisation, I would say, but particularly at really hierarchical legacy organisations like NZME.
So, I mean, in some ways, like the Devlin thing, it's fascinating in and of itself. But if you look at where the largest part of your careers has been spent reporting, it is on the public sector side. Like it's largely about the state and its failings. Do you have you've now been a reporter in this areas for at least a decade, like a solid decade. Do you have a sense that the needle is moving? Because, I mean, these are obviously decades, centuries old problems, failures that the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse in State Care would suggest that we just aren't anywhere near solving. Do you feel like you're starting to see motion there?
I think so. I'm pretty cynical, and particularly writing about something like the family court, which is it's a lot. And law is it's a long thing and it takes a long time to change. But I think in other places you are seeing differences, and you see it in the way that men react, like, oh, we can't say anything anymore. It's like, no, you can't. You cannot. Sorry about it. You can't comment on my face or my hair or my boobs, and I quite like it, and I don't really care if you don't like it. So even those little things are that's good. That is society shifting, and I think the fact we have the abuse inquiry is a good thing. And I mean, I hope the one thing that comes out of that is the cover-up by the state agencies. That's the bigger problem, that abuse happens and then other people work. You can read Aaron Smale's stories about it. There were structures set up to just, again, limit liability to the state. And it's not like we're talking about, I don't know, something small. It's abused children. And they had all the mechanisms swinging behind to do that. And I think that's where the light needs to shine, really. We know that humans are capable of abusing other people. We don't really need to go into the gratuitous detail of that. But the way the state reacts is what I would find really interesting. Yeah,
it's almost on an enormous scale, the version of the HR department that it just exists to propagate the mothership. We've just got to take a very quick break right now, and then I'll return for a little longer with Kirsty Johnston. The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to oOh!media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
Before we move on and talk about your newish workplace and stuff, I just want to talk about a couple more of your sort of biggest stories and probably potentially most impactful, and that is Ashley Peacock and seclusion, which felt like it was something that no one knew was happening, and you put it on the front page of the paper and made it so that no one anywhere near it could look away.
Yeah. God, I had balls, eh? That was a lot. I don't know where I got the confidence to just be so anyway, let's go and hide in a bush and video this disabled guy with his carers, and then just take that paparazzi video of this guy, put it on the front page of the paper, and just not stop banging on about it. Like, even now, I think it was maybe 5 years ago. But I'm like, wow, I really, really went at that.
But it was, again, you could just sort of feel the kind of moral force of just having seen this thing and thinking this just can't be, not in this country, not without someone who is ultimately responsible having to look it in the eye and say either I'll change that or I'm fine with that.
Yeah, well, I think, because I remember they had, like, Ashley's kind of advocacy team had been trying to get me to write about him for ages. And I was like, well, what's different? Like, I've read there had been some other stories in the Dominion Post about him being locked up. I think it was the front page. But I think what was different was that they had the report that said, like, these 3 experts had said it is wrong and it is making him worse. Like, the way they're treating him is making him worse. And I think it was something about a breach of his human rights. And I was like, it's all there. Like, it's all there. It wasn't really that risky, to be honest, because it was in black and white that he was being, like, one step down from tortured, whatever that is, you know. Like, they didn't go quite as far as saying in the Ombudsman report that he was tortured, but they may as well. So really, like, it was quite, like, I think if you take a human rights framework, it makes it easier, because you do literally have moral authority. So if you bang on about stuff, like, obviously you go through these dark periods where you're like, oh God, have I bitten off more than I can chew, and what am I doing, and do I write another story about this? But if you have, like, that kind of paperwork, I guess, it makes it easier.
And what happened at the back of that? Like, did things change? And is that, you must find that kind of satisfying when there is actual movement? Yeah,
so Ashley, he was, you know, incarcerated in a psychiatric facility in a really small room, and he shouldn't have been there. And they eventually let him go and move to his own house where he has, like, chickens and dogs, and, you know, that's very nice. I mean, he's still very unwell because he was unwell to start with, but also because of that, you know, incarceration. But yeah, I don't know more broadly if anything's changed, to be honest. Like, there were other Ashleys at the time. I really wanted to write about them. Some of them don't have families. Like, he had a very vocal and very educated family, which is part of the reason his story was easy to tell. Yeah, I don't really know how much has changed on a broad scale, you know, and which is really hard and kind of doesn't bear thinking about.
You don't want to be solving these things one by one. That's the whole structural change thing you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and in Ashley's case, I don't really know if we got that structural case, but to be fair, in his case, I'm just happy that it was good for him, you know.
Is there a story of yours that has had that kind of bigger structural legal change?
Oh yeah, well, I got schools to stop locking disabled children in cupboards, so that was quite good, which was legal apparently until Hekia Parata outlawed it after one of my stories. It's special education for you, eh? They're like, oh, we've got these rooms where we're just going to seclude children who have, you know, autism, and that's fine. And I exposed that, and we got a law change there, which is good. That's good.
Do you feel like that happens often enough? Because it can sometimes feel like there's a you know, just in the same way that the state kind of, for many years, I'm sure still does, kind of rear up to cover up and protect liability of those who are abused in its care, that can also feel like there's a kind of comms industrial complex that seeks to sort of delay and obfuscate and just generally kind of shrink something to the point where it can be answered with a concerned look at a press conference and we'll look into that, rather than actually just very quickly stopping the thing.
Yeah, and I think it depends the size of the thing you take on too, right? So children being secluded at school, easy fix. Just don't do that. They just changed the law. The other one that I got a repeal of Part 4A of the Health and Disability Act, which was about family carers. So that was a law, like, long history, but it basically banned family members of the disabled for being paid for caring for them. And we got that repealed because it was discriminatory. So that's really good. It's like on a broader scale. But again, it's like a very small thing. Whereas the reporting that I'm doing now, I would say, is kind of trying to, like, back up the truck of patriarchy, which is, you know, it's a bit bigger. And, you know, like, it's particularly things like legal systems where everyone who works in that system is invested in believing that it is a good and good system that works. And if you say, hey, I don't think it works, like that, it's a lot for people to try and get their heads around. They get really defensive. Yeah, because they're invested, and because it's hard. It's a hard thing to think about. So
especially not if you're like really deep into your career and there's someone who's basically saying it's kind of been, not a scam, but it's been a little bit scammy.
This isn't great. Have you guys thought about like maybe just getting rid of it? Like someone said the other day to me, I can't remember who it was, I was whinging about the court system again. They're like, well, what do you want to do, Kirsty? You just get rid of the Westminster system? And I was like, yeah, maybe. Like small goals. I think my boss is probably just like, Christ, can you just pick a small piece of legislation and get that changed rather than trying to, like upend the entire structure the world's built on?
I mean, that's going to take some time, so I should probably let you go. I wanted to ask one more question, though, which was kind of led us back to this in a way, in that if you're trying to create journalism that tells us individual stories that speak to much wider issues and have huge impacts and ultimately change the realities that produce those situations, you're kind of going to want as many people as possible to read it. Up until a year or so ago, you were at the Herald and behind the paywall, which is a great thing for the funding of the media, but it does necessarily shrink the audience for those stories and potentially with it the impact of them. You've since moved to Stuff, which is still free to all. Do you want to talk a bit about your sense of how your work was impacted by the arrival of the paywall, and then with it moving out from under that again, what your sense is of whether that does have an influence on how hard it hits?
Yeah, so when the paywall first came in, I was like really supportive of it, obviously, because, having free media has been problematic. And then I kind of quickly realised that I didn't really have a place in an organisation that had a paywall, by which I mean, so it changed the measures of success, right? So pre-paywall, measure of success for your story was like either, okay, you got a law change, which is like good, like that's a societal thing, but the main measure was obviously clicks, right? So how many eyeballs are in your story, or like engagement time, which is how long people read it for. And those are valuable to advertisers because, eyeballs. Anyway, so after the paywall came in, the measures of success changed, and that if your story was paywalled, it was good if it got subscribers. And so like your average good story probably was getting like 5 to 10. Like if you got 5, you're like, oh my God, I got 5 subscribers.
That's a huge number still.
Yeah, you're excited. And then, because it kind of came in and then COVID happened, and then I remember writing a story about like Marist, which had an outbreak, a cluster, and that got like 100 subscribers, right? And then other people were writing stories all around me, and you could see which ones were getting subscribers, and they were like Audrey Young's political work, her columns, because she's authoritative, right? So people wanted to know what she said, things like that. And then just stuff about rich people was like another one. And so Marist, right, it's a rich private school, and so the parents of the children that go there can afford to subscribe. So that started happening, and I was like, these aren't the stories that I write, okay? So you either had that, or you were writing what I would call clickbait, like stories that are obviously going to get a lot of clicks, or stuff that's happening on that day, like, something blowing up somewhere, and that was obviously going to be free. And so my stories like really fell in a gap between that.
Did you find that there was pressure from senior editorial leaders about where to put your time and energy out the back of that shift into conversions?
Yeah, there was talk about it a lot. They kind of had this thing where they were like, we either do stories that get lots of clicks, or we do stories that get lots of subscribers, and nothing in between. And so I fell in the in between. I remember raising it and saying, hey, this is a problem, because my stories are like, the people who read them, the subscribers in particular who read them, would read the whole thing, right? And they liked them, and they get a lot of Twitter profile. But they weren't getting like they weren't leading the site.
It's a weird, like you can kind of almost imagine it. Like, would you like to pay $250 a year to read this super harrowing thing? I mean, humans should behave like that, but they're probably never going to.
No, and, stories about poor people don't generate subscriptions. stories about the marginalised and all that don't generate subscriptions. Stories about like gender inequality for women in the workplace don't generate subscriptions. They generate a lot of angry emails from men, but that doesn't translate into money.
Can you monetize angry emails from men?
How to monetize incels? So I fell in the cracks, and it was just really hard, and I didn't feel like it just didn't feel sustainable.
How's it feel being over at Stuff, which, has, I think, under Sinead's management, particularly her ownership, feels like it's animated by some quite different, it just feels like it's moved.
Yeah. It was so funny when I first got there. I was quite burnt out. There was the other reason for a change. I was just at the end of a road where I really should have taken a lot more time off. But because I had the concussion, I eventually ended up getting some of that. But yeah, when I first got to
Stuff... that it takes a concussion. Go journalism.
Yeah. But yeah, when I got to Stuff, I remember pitching my stories and still pitching them in a very Herald way, which is to try and trick an editor into running your story by pitching it in a way that sounds less kind of feminist or less, social justice warrior than it was. And then I eventually realized they didn't. They were it's fine, just write the story. You don't have to try and make it less of what it is. So that was good. And yeah, I think Stuff's going for that trust model, and that's kind of a more natural fit for me at this point. And it's not to say that the Herald doing the payroll is good or bad or makes better or worse journalism. It just didn't make a place for what I wanted to do.
So you're up here for the Voyager Awards.
Yes.
How many are up for?
One, Duncan.
Just one?
Just one.
Unbelievable. Sort it out, Voyager's judges.
No, look, it's fine. I'm surprised that I'm even up for one after last year. And I, again, thanks to my occupational therapist, Sonia, I don't, it's not one of my measures of success that I wrote in my wee notebook anymore. So I'm not worried about it, but I am excited to see everyone.
Cool. Well, good luck to you, Kirsty, and thank you so much for coming on The Fold.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun. Fun and stressful.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spin-off Podcast Network.